Hello, this is James Merrigan at Small Night Projects, and I had this strange thought today that I would speak in the second person, referring to the book as you in these conversations with art publications, but I may leave that to another day. This book is perhaps a little bit unlikely in the sense that I've been trying to cover artist books that are made independently and DIY. But the Royal Book Lodge, not to be mistaken for the Royal Art Lodge, that Canadian group of artists that emerged in the 90s collaboratively, including Marcel Zama, who made work together collectively and naively. Now, this is the Royal Book Lodge, and usually when I bring these up, people go, "Oh, the painters," or no, it's a collective that emerged 10 years earlier in France, in this place called. It looks like it should be sounded out as Montreal, but I think in French it's Montreuil or something like that. I can't get the pronunciation right, but I think it's a town or city in France. And this couple of immigrants from, I'm not sure if both were from the former Soviet Union, but the names, I think Veronique Bourgon and Julie Sassoon, they ended up, I think they were partners or married, and they had a kid later, but they started this collective, among others. I think there was another person, Goffman, and they started this, I don't know whether to call it a collective or a movement. As immigrants, they had this tendency to work on the move and relocate. Even though they had a base in Montreuil, they reached out internationally. And in a way, when I bring up that word international, they had inherited, because they had actually communicated with some of the previous situationist international artists of, the 40s, 50s, 60s, whatever time they were coming out of. Like, I'm thinking here of Guy Debord and his novel from 1967, The Society of the Spectacle. And they do inherit, in some part, that revolutionary zeal, but in a more poetic sense, a more symbolic sense. So whereas Guy Debord and his fellow peers and artists in the Situationist International movement, they were very much militant, revolutionary, Marxist. They felt that, especially at the beginning, that art should try to avoid commodification and be more connected with life. And their technique of detournement, which was an appropriation and reframing of images and culture towards their ideology, their Marxist ideology, was more revolutionary than the Royal Book Lodge's ideals. For, of course, change and societal change, but it seems, reading this book, and there's a lot in this book, especially the essay by John C. Welchman, whom I'm a very big fan of. I think he's the best, like in the vein of Isabel Graw, he's the best art historian writer. Just the way he writes, his use of language, his arguments, his insights. I'm a massive fan of him. And I'm a massive fan of Isabel Graw. But Welchman it's something about Welchman's position where he aligns himself with artists that are very much risk oriented and they're on the periphery. And one of the first books, just as a tangent, one of the first books here, edited by John C. Welchman, is Statements, Conversations, Proposals by Mike Kelly, named Minor Histories. And Welchman, Mike Kelly as a kind of peripheral, visceral, in the vein of, Paul McCarthy, etc. There's a kind of punkishness in Kelly's position as an artist. But there's also a kind of zine culture, a youth culture, that I think Welchman is attracted to. This book here is also edited by John C. Welchman. And why I bought this book, I didn't know Welchman was the editor, but Brock Enright was in it. And Brock Enright is an artist who, in the 2000s, perhaps, he was in college in New York. I don't know if it was Columbia or somewhere, but to get by, he set up a company where he kidnapped clients who had paid for his services to enact a kind of fetish fantasy torture scenario where Enright would pick them up in a van and bring them somewhere and do stuff to them that they had, in some ways, the client had scripted. And when I was in New York in 2007, I went to this gallery in Chelsea, and there was a Brock Enright show on, and it was the first time I'd come across this artist. And he had represented the scenarios that he had documented all these scenarios with these clients, and then he represented them in the gallery. And it just changed my whole idea around art. And just in terms of risk, and there's a brilliant essay in this by Welchman on the aesthetics of risk, but also the release after enacting risk. So catharsis. And not just catharsis in the artist, the feeling of relief after a kind of traumatic or risk-oriented process, but also the catharsis that the viewer feels, as I felt when I was in amidst all of these represented real life but scripted scenarios. So anyway, I digress. And so Royal Book Lodge are not the Royal Art Lodge, but they have a similar sentiment in the sense of poetic sentiment. There's a kind of naivete. On the cover, we have this, it is a gorgeous book. When I bought it, I didn't think it would arrive like this. It's very coffee table, perhaps, but it's beautiful. It has this debossed image on the front, and I suspect it's by Andy Hope, 1930, who was just a great artist. I don't know where his name comes from. I think it's a combination of Andy Warhol, and the hope, perhaps, is this kind of orientation towards kind of naivete, and also hope, literally. But then in 1930, his work is from this era of, comic strip, the emergence of comics, Superman. He makes beautiful paintings, really quirky paintings, but also these staged dioramas, comic strip kind of stuff. But definitely this is a variant of that, kind of scratched into the cover. Has this pearlescent green, this chrome, beautiful. And it's by this company, publishing house. I haven't looked them up. Hat J. Kantz, and I have come across them several times. Welchman has 2 collections of essays with Sternberg Press, and he was due 4 collections. and somehow they stopped. And Hatche Kant's publishing house are bringing out the third edition of his writings on Mike Kelly. And it's weird, something happened maybe there in the contract. Maybe he wasn't happy with Sternberg, or Sternberg weren't happy with him, whatever. Anyway, it's changed hands, I think. So, the Royal Book Lodge. I want to talk about just a few things in this and why I'm interested in it. Because, I founded Small Night Projects in 2019, just before the pandemic. And the reason for it was I'd been producing books with commercial printers for years. And I just got sick of, first of all, either designing my own stuff on Photoshop or InDesign, whatever, and then paying out money to graphic designers, or paying out money to commercial printers. So I wanted to set up something independent. And I was talking to a colleague of mine at Gorey School of Art, and she said, why don't you try a screen printing? And so I just tried it out. I got some funding in the beginning. I bought some inks. This is my garage. This is where I'm speaking from now. There's no heating or anything in here, but it does the job. It's like 4 meters by 4 meters space, very small, but it's done me now for 6 years, and I've printed and edited with other artists and artist editors, publications, lots of them. I say numbering probably 30 at the moment. And when I came across the Royal Book Lodge, I bought this book about 2 years ago, and I didn't know they existed. It was Welchman really that attracted me to the Royal Book Lodge, because I knew his positioning. And so I've been reading this for the last week. It's a very long piece by Welchman. One thing about him as an art historian, he understands the lineage and the inheritance of where Royal Book Lodge is coming from. And it's rigorously researched. And he's having conversations with the artists. He's known the artists for a very long time. So there's a real generosity in terms of the information he's giving, but also the reflections on the culture at the moment and how Royal Book Lodge has changed over time, and how perhaps it did emerge inheriting the situationist international Marxist tendencies, but then has become more poetic and naive, and in a sense it is kind of always moving, always changing. And some of the artists that are part of this became, or already were, blue chip artists like Jason Rhodes, who was with Hauser and Wirth, who I think he passed away in his 30s or early 40s. Raymond Pettibon. There's lots of work in here by Raymond Pettibon. You see here I've written loads of notes. This is Kai Atoff, one of my favorite artists. So you get, I don't know if this is actually a print, a lithograph, but it's been stuck onto the page. It's one of those old-fashioned ways, old-fashioned art books that sometimes they stick the image onto the page. And Jonathan Mies, the ceramics in this book by Jonathan Mies are just spectacular. Just blown away by, and it's something I knew Jonathan Mies's work, his performance especially. So here's some of the ceramics. This is Andy Hope, 1930, Vertical Horizon. So this is Jonathan Mies here. These are some of the books. by Jonathan Mies, but they have ceramics on them. So it's just, here we go again. Just really cool stuff. There's a Jonathan Mies. It looks like there's a urinal. There's a sink. There's this tile backdrop of pink tiles. Just really cool stuff. And there's also Miroslav Tichy, that Czech Republic artist, who was very contentious in a sense that he was a real outsider, that he made his own cameras and then took images of younger girls. So he's in this as well, which, I've on my travels in Europe, I've come across some exhibitions by Tichy, and you're always wondering, there is an argument in this book that, Tichy, it's argued around Tichy that he's a primitive, unschooled, uneducated, and then you learn in this that he understood Greek and Latin and all this kind of stuff. So kind of the mythology of these artists is also exposed in this a little bit. It doesn't give excuses, perhaps, for their subject matter, but there is, in all these DIY, I don't want to call them enterprises, because they're not, but these kind of DIY movements, transgression and all that stuff does play out in them. They're trying to express things that may not be, or may be censored in mainstream publishing houses, and they're trying to push the boundaries of art and what it means, and especially coming out of the Situationist International. The Royal Book Lodge is not that. It isn't contentious or revolutionary or militant or even Marxist, but it is giving free expression. And it's interesting when two of the founders, so I think I mentioned them already, Julie Sassoon and Veronique Bourgon, when they talk about Tichy. So I think I have it noted down here on page 64. I'm trying to excuse Tichy now. His photographs are absolutely beautiful. So here's some of Tichy's photographs. So in here they seem tame in a certain way. Like, I'll just have. So what's great about this book is that it gives you spreads of some of their publications, and they're beautifully made. Just when you see the alternating beige with white backdrops, these are just some things that I would love to take from, because I think they're just beautiful. But in these images here, so this one by Tichy, you see these edges. It's like it's been cut out, and they're retaining this kind of rawness. And I just want to read out a bit about what Welchman says about these. The web of mythology and misrepresentation woven around the work of Tichy since it emerged into public visibility some 2 decades ago is so formidable that one can only approach his body of photographs by engaging with the cliches and assumptions on which it depends. First, there is Tichy, the man, dishevelled in appearance, seemingly single-minded to the point of dissolution, possessed of a photographic will, completely married to his singular vision, presenting as an incontrovertible, even inexorable figure. This editorial image gives rise, secondly, to Tichy the primitive, an autodidact, as his earliest critics contended, who was unencumbered by any of his historical or professional markers of the photographic, whether avant-garde, documentary, or even amateur. That word amateur is so important today for artists. He was primitive too. He has sometimes been assumed in his manner and address, and primitive again, or simply reconstructed in relation to his female photographic subjects. This is the issue here, whom he hunts or stalks unapologetically on the small town streets of Kijov in Moravia and in various public facilities. Finally, he has been seen as primitive technologically, using homemade cameras supplied with repurposed hand-ground lenses, making casual, fragile photographs poorly fixed by the standards of a professional darkroom. The photos are often dirty, wrinkled, and creased, and deeply entropic in the sense that they seem to be on the threshold of giving up their ghosts and returning the images they so diffidently engendered to the disintegrating particles from which they emerged. Like Welchman is just a beautiful writer, tying in as it does to the wider RBL aesthetic, Royal Book Lodge, of provisionality and dissolution. Susan describes this aspect of Tishi's work with particular relish. So this is Julie Susan describing Tishi's work and the merits of it and the value of it beyond the subject. So it's about form. And this is what you get from this book, how things are in terms of form rather than content, although they're indivisible. He notes the disappearance of the shadows on the paper, how the silver surface turns into light dust, leaving around the bodies flowery halos, as if the light was crystallized in salt, and the temporal anomalies that ensue, leading to the gradual disappearance of the world that contained the image, and the persistence of a metaphor of disappearance that is present at all levels of Tishi's work. Just even, the founding members of the Royal Book Lodge have this poetic sensibility when describing the form of the artists they collaborate, work with, or actually support in the production of these books that anchor the Royal Book Lodge, even though it's a transient and itinerant movement of immigrants, mainly, working together. What else? They also refer to this. I suppose this book is broken up into ceramics, film, photography, mythologies, biography, lots of different things. It's not a history of the Royal Book Lodge, but it's a kind, and that's weirdly when I'm talking about form. And it's interesting, Welchman has broken this down into form rather than content as an art historian. That form is intrinsic to their sensibility. That it is not about the message, it is about the medium. And the message is, of course, indivisible from that. But it's how they present the artist's work they work with and the form it takes. And I think the way they present work is just spellbinding, just beautiful. When I think about the situationists, I think about how they were quite forceful in their attempts to enact politics, ideology through art. And I think Guy Debord ended up in the end giving up on that ideal. Weirdly, the Royal Book Lodge, if they're a transitional movement from the situationists, then this is the aftermath of that. It's after communism. It's after the Marxist ideal. So there's something, it's kind of a remainder. And it's interesting to look at all the work in this, especially by the two founders. There's a kind of what Guy Debord calls, to describe modern life is to observe um, mutancy, the mutation, of the world. And that seems what modern life is today, that it is gradually mutating into something more monstrous and broken down. And that's what you get from this book. One artist that I love in this is Andy Hope, of course, Kai Ottoff, but Andy Hope is absolutely fabulous. There's also something I want to look at in terms of the Situationists. I think it's on page 112. It might give a better sense of what they're trying to do here. So they're very much engaged with photography. This is Jason Rhodes, beautiful publication. There's lots of photography in here. Just going to find 112. Raymond Pettibon, beautiful. So I put a note here for this. So, like I suppose as a middle-aged artist, working in a studio, trying to work with artists to make publications, I do have an ideology now that has formed, especially due to Instagram and due to a real commodification of the artwork. Of course, the commodity of art has always been there. And as a fan of Isabel Graw and her art market discourse and critique of that, but also being involved in its proliferation, I'm becoming more sensitive to the artist's plight and the artist's plight in relation to the gallery system, the market, and the mutated desires of the artist to be represented by a gallery. I think today this is the worst dream, the worst desire for an artist to be wanting gallery representation or even to be in a white wall gallery. I think there's something, as someone who's not in the game, who is not an exhibiting artist, I was over 10 years ago, but I left that behind after having kids. And I've had this DIY kind of ideology ever since then, since I left the game, left the competition. And this book is really a reflection of a lot of my ideals and really the issues of today in terms of the commodification of art, the professionalization of art, whether in art schools or in the art world proper. And I just want to read this bit by Welchman. Once again, it just shows his prowess for prose of a particularly critical and historical and reflective type. So I want to start here. It needs to be said from the outset that the RBL had more faith in the capacities of art to intervene in the social arena than Guy Debord, in his later writings at least, and for the most part did not share Debord's progressively unshakable suspicion that art, according to received practices and definitions, was effectively useless in resisting the omnipotence of the spectacle. Instead, the group maintained unpredictable and shifting modes of confidence in the efficacy of art conceived in different terms, whether or not these could be designated aesthetic. The RBL began its work in an era in which the project of a social revolution, conceived in even the most renovated of Marxist terms, was scarcely viable, especially for Susan and Goffman founders who had grown up in the former Soviet Union. So Veronique Bourgon must be French. The renewal of human relations that they sought was thus conceived in proximity to material and ephemeral practices of and experiments with art and publication, rather than a direct, theoretically oriented critique of late capitalist modes of production and the ideological smokescreens and filters that secured them. This is not to say, however, that the RBL was not committed to making work that reflected on and intervened in questions of inequality, injustice, and violence. But their concept of art was not programmatically or consistently socially diagnostic or overtly politically remedial. And when it did expand into these signifying territories, it was with stealth and camouflage. That's just beautiful. Cézanne's systematic aversion to political illustrationism. So Cézanne's systematic aversion to political illustrationism, a situation in which, as he put it in 2004, the worst spectacle is didactic spectacle. Just think of today in the politics of art, accords with Raymond Pettibon's reflections on social messaging in an interview 10 years later. So 2014, Raymond Pettibon said this: "There is something about the idea of an artist at work that provokes the condemnation and the mistrust of those who hold power. It's incompatible simply because we do not offer trivial, easy to understand didactic messages." So I know that was a lot there, but really in a way, the Royal Book Lodge emerges because First of all, artists, a group of artists are exiled. They become immigrants, and they become disaffected, and they become critical of the art world at large. And they find alternative spaces for art that is not framed by a white cube or money, the market. They de-objectify in a certain way art, but also retain art as a book, which is not really an object. It's something that you open, it's something you touch, it's something that frays at the edges. It's something that is an experience as you flick through it, or paginate through it, whatever you want to say. But just going through this book, there's also something about photography here where, especially in relation to Andy Hope, 1930, where there's a lot of wonderful installation shots of Andy Hope's work in certain situations. Let's call them situations. And in a way, there's a new staging where the work takes on a new life in this new type of staging that is not promotional. So it's not the artist standing in front of their work on Instagram, striking a pose, a pose that is nonplussed, that has no emotion. It's very much a staging that creates a new artwork, that creates a new perspective in relation to the work. I'm going to try and get you some images of Andy Hope's work because it's a real highlight. I saw Andy Hope's work. So this is Veronique Bourgon, one of the founders of RBL. And this is a shot of the exhibition Sweet Troubled Souls by Andy Hope, 1930, in an apartment in Paris in 2007. And it's a black and white photograph printed on fine art paper, 40 by 60. And you can see Andy Hope's work here. There's beautiful reflections here in this press. But also here's Andy Hope's work, the wallpaper, the staging. I'm not sure if this is Andy Hope sitting here. He is quite a character. I think he's on Instagram. But here's some more beautiful images. Here's another one by Julie Sussan, photograph of Summoning by Andy Hope. So this was a sculptural piece. Andy Hope again. Tichy. I don't know. I think I showed you Raymond Pettibon. Here's a painting by Andy Hope. Those painters who are looking, I think, just have a look at this. Beautiful. Just a choice of frame. I was talking to Damien Flood actually about frames recently, which will be released soon. 2005. Just beautiful painting. Yeah, as I said, I saw his work in Venice. Nearly a retrospective of his work there. Darkened space, black walls, I think, lit up, staged. Julie Sassoon. There's a lot of the founders' work in this throughout. They are a mainstay, whereas the others are transient. But they're working to this day. But yeah, it's a beautiful thing. I don't think I can find the Andy Hope 1930 stage set. Anyway, it's in here somewhere. But what I would say is I think this is an alternative, basically. That the Royal Book Lodge present an alternative that, after not receiving Arts Council funding recently, and it's been successive years that I haven't received it, and I continue on. Sorry about there's an ambulance going by there. I more and more want to take this path where I get to work with artists, but it's a kind of transaction of generosity, that there's no funding involved, there's no fee, that the work is on both me and the artist, and that out of that comes something that is independent, that is ours completely, that in some ways is anti-institutional. I'm tired of all the institutional politics that we're involved in, whether it's funding galleries, private and public, museums. I'm tired that events can't take place without funding. And we don't have any private eccentric billionaires here, so we can't do some Jeff Koons mad shit. So we need to find alternative processes and ways of making and distributing and disseminating art that is not attached to institutions. And I think if there's more of us just working on our own passion and will for this kind of stuff, then things can happen. We don't need to depend on funding. And we can just slow things down as well. We don't have to be so productive. Let's take 3 years to do something rather than trying to pack a project into a year. And it's just a waiting time. When you spend a month or more on an application and then you have to wait 6 months for the decision, you kind of, a dependency starts to click in. And when you don't get it then after the 6 month wait, then you have to scrape everything away and start again. You have to send out the emails to people that you asked to contribute to the project or the bursary or whatever it is. And you say, oh, sorry, not this time. And then you receive these emails, oh, hard luck, better luck next time. And there's no invitation. Oh, let's try and do this anyway. Jesus Christ. So I'm going to stop there before I say something that I'll regret. But anyway, this is where I'm at. This is what I'm thinking about. I've already reached out to artists, whether cold called them or I've invited them through an open submission process, which you'll find on my website, fireartsale.org. There's an open submission there for a project. But I'm going to take down that website soon as well, because I just can't afford these placeholders, online placeholders where nothing happens. So if you want to follow me, it's Merrigan at Substack, and I hope to do more of these. But listen, Royal Book Lodge, John C. Welchman, brilliant. I don't know what I said there, but that's the purpose of these things. Anyway, thank you for listening, and I'll be back.